Hello, everybody. Welcome. As you can see, I walked in. We're on the air. We're on late. We're on the wrong channel. We're not exactly sure what's going on. Hopefully, some people managed to find us. We're talking to the people who are over on channel 10 right now to redirect.
This is 10.
Oh, we're on 10. So they got jumped to 16 and we're on late. But anyway, welcome to the Atheist Experience. This is what you get with public access live television. It's February 18th, 2007. We're live and we're on the air, and we're going to keep on trucking and find out what went on later. Welcome, as I said, this is the Atheist Experience. I'm Matt Dillahunty, your host. Joining me this week, Tracie Harris. Welcome.
Thank you.
Which, it was good because traffic was horrible and you would have been late.
Yes, I was late.
Well, you're only late if the show had already started. But this is a live, interactive, public access television program where we take the opportunity to answer questions about atheists and atheism, discuss current events that are relevant towards church-state separation and other issues, and present an opportunity for dialogue and debate among the community. It's a chance to show people that atheists aren't evil monsters bent on destroying all that you hold precious and dear. We're people like anybody else. We just happen to have different views on a few things, most specifically the existence of a God. So we've got some regular announcements to get out of the way, and then we'll get on to the presentation portion. Tracie's got some stuff to talk about, and we'll have the phone number up for you shortly. As I said, this is a live call-in program. Anybody in the Austin area is welcome to call in and talk to us. You can talk about the subject or anything else that happens to be on your mind. We're sponsored by the Atheist Community of Austin, a nonprofit educational organization which promotes positive atheism and the separation of church and state. The ACA is currently having meetings every Sunday at Ventana del Sol on Old Torf. Those meetings are 11:30. Ventana del Sol is a change from us. We were going to restaurants before. This is more of a meeting place, coffee shop and pastries and things that you can get to eat and sit around and discuss. It's quieter. We don't interfere with the public, and the public doesn't interfere with us that much. Any atheist or atheist-friendly people are welcome to come to that, as well as the other events that I'm about to talk about. We don't have membership requirements for any of the things we do. The audio portion of this program is available on our website, www.atheist-community.org. If you click on the Atheist Experience logo, or you can go to atheist-experience.com. In the archive section, the audio is listed there. And now the video portion is available on Google Video. So all around the world, people can not only listen to us, but they can see us, which means they got to see me walk in late and see that we're going to be doing a slightly shorter show today. But we'll make do. In addition to this program, the ACA also sponsors a bi-weekly internet audio program called The Nonprofits. That's Prophets. Oh, you're not on the air. We'll be live again on February 24th. That's next Saturday at 2 p.m. Central. For more information, you can go to nonprofitsradio.com. You can also find a link from the Atheist Community website. We do that show live. We run a chat room in conjunction with it. There's directions on how to connect on our internet site. We don't take phone calls. How many times have I said in the last minute?
I have no idea.
I love when things get kind of messed up. Just for those of you who are watching, and just because I think it's a little amusing, we started late. We thought we were on the wrong channel. We got on the right channel. We have one camera working instead of two, and the phone lines earlier were making like space alien noises when we were doing the sound checks. So we're going to have a lot of fun today. In addition to the Sunday morning meeting, the ACA sponsors a number of social events throughout the week. On Thursdays, we have Atheist Happy Hour at Ninfa's on Anderson near 183 and I-35. That's 7:30. You're welcome to come down and get something to eat, something to drink, visit with some of the members of the ACA. And after this program, we get together and we go to Threadgills on Riverside. Everybody involved in the show, the cast, the crew, tend to go down there. And we invite members of the public who want to come down and just have a good meal and a discussion to come and join us. If you're coming down to preach or proselytize, don't bother. We'll put the phone number up for you shortly, and you can call in and explain why you think your views are right and ours are wrong, or whatever the case may be. Mentioning Ventana del Sol earlier, last Sunday, on the 11th, we celebrated the ACA's 10th anniversary at Ventana del Sol, and it went really well. We had a lot of people down there. We had some of the founding members of the ACA in a panel discussion to talk about the early days of the ACA. We had a cake. Don Rhodes made a great toast, and we talked about things we're going to be doing in the future. I gave as president of the ACA, I gave the first State of the ACA address, and what we're seeing down the road. things we'd like to do. And one of the things, membership's open and available to any non-theist, and you can contact the ACA to talk to any one of the board of directors about membership, and that there's nothing, like I said, we don't require membership for any of our events. We host a lecture series on the first Sunday of every month. So instead of going to Ventana del Sol on that week, we go to the Austin History Center located at the corner of 9th and Guadalupe. That's the first Sunday, and I don't have the information for the March lecture on me. But that one's openly public as well. And rather than, repeating the same phrase for the 12th time, how you doing?
Good. I'm still jittery from running in here like.
I just casually walked. I was out there trying to figure out why we weren't on the air and just walked right back in.
Yeah. Okay.
So what do you got for us?
Today we sort of picked our topic based on a viewer piece of mail.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go ahead and read.
Sure.
We're just going to say Brandon. We won't mention last names, but Brandon wrote in to the TV list and said, just watching one of your old episodes, and one of your callers asked how the panel felt about suicide. And it reminded me of a question I had asked myself about the idea of that Christians hold about suicide is a sin. So I wondered if it actually talked about it in the Bible. I did a quick search online and could only find Christian sites that gave indirect evidence of why suicide was wrong, but I couldn't find any scriptural proof that it was a sin. So I wondered if you guys could address this question in one of your shows. Of course, I'm not looking to espouse the idea that suicide is okay, but I just wanted to make the point that if the Bible doesn't implicitly forbid the act of suicide, then why don't more believers do it? I would much rather go to heaven immediately, especially if I'm young enough to where I haven't had much time to commit any sin, so I could spend eternity in bliss. Wouldn't you?
While the point's made kind of, humorously or pointing out the absurdity of the idea.
Right.
We talked about this before with regard to like parents who have killed their
like
kids.
Andrea Yates.
Yeah, Andrea Yates. And really, if the paradigm that they believe is correct, then that's the right action, or at least it's an action that gets the result that they're looking for.
Well, I would say that it would be a logical action.
Sure.
I'm not sure that I would say that it's right or that they would feel it's right, but certainly if I were still a Christian, I would have to acknowledge that I would feel that Andrea Yates' children were in heaven.
Yeah.
That would be my response, is that she killed them and it was horrible, but they're all in heaven now, and they're with God. That's what would have been my attitude. And I realize that, Christians are not going to say that suicide is all right, but at the same time, it is, what he's saying is logical, that if you don't believe it's a sin, and you do believe that, death is to be with God, and that, life is living sort of under that curse of Adam's fall from grace in this life with pain and suffering and death, that certainly it would be preferable to be dead and in heaven with God.
Yeah.
So there's a certain logic to the question.
Although we are really talking about it like from strictly a Christian perspective.
Correct.
And not other theologies. Although you're going to touch on them a little bit with regard to Judaism.
We're looking at it from a biblical perspective.
Right.
So it's going to include Old Testament and New Testament. Right. I myself was sort of surprised because before I started to look at the information, I'm fairly familiar with the Bible. I think probably at least as much, if not more so, than just the average person on the street. And I thought that I had my idea of what I would feel about what the Bible said about it. And I was kind of surprised at what I found. And I think that my attitude has changed somewhat in that I've gone from thinking that the Bible was silent on the issue to realizing that there's a little bit more suicide mentioned in the Bible than I realized. There's a couple of suicides that were people that I just didn't recall ever reading about. But there was one in particular that, and I think we've talked about this before, when you're involved in fundamentalist Christianity and you're very into it like I was, there's sort of a part of your brain that is devoted to that religion. And then you don't connect that to the rest of reality. You sort of isolate that and you insulate it from any kind of arguments against it. You have a defense mechanism that you don't want to hear something that contradicts it. You will accept any explanation, no matter how far-fetched, that sounds even potentially reasonable, over something that seems very reasonable that contradicts what you believe. I've done it, and I've seen many, many other people do it, and most of the people I know who are, ex-fundamentalist Christian that are involved in atheism now understand completely what I'm talking about.
It's kind of a confirmation bias where you're more you put more weight and more emphasis on the evidence that seems to support your idea.
Right, and let me point out too, just to be fair, this is not only a problem with religion. I mean, this is something people do with politics. This is something people do with any sort of belief system. It can even be like a cultural bias, something that you just think your culture, does something the right way, and you just don't want to hear it. There could be no other way to do this, and it doesn't have to be religion. Everybody has the capacity to sort of insulate a certain area of their belief system from attack. And absolutely, that's what I did. And I think to this day, it sort of bothers me that I'll read things in the Bible that I know I've read before, but I see them now and I think, how did I not recognize this about it? Like, how did I not see what I was actually looking at? How did I think this was a good thing? How did I, on and on and on.
I've had a number of discussions with, because I'm, like you, a former Christian, and was studying hopefully to be a minister at some point, I get a lot more mail from believers. I mean, some of the mail comes into the show, and instead of directing it to the show or whatever, it's, "Hey Matt," and then it's, we have these long discussions, and I try to answer as many of them as I can, and I've had lengthy discussions with a number of believers of different, slightly different Christian beliefs, and then some that are non-Christian at all, and when I'm talking to Christians, and I mention, they're curious as to what led me to discard my Christianity. What was it about my studies that specifically made me think Christianity can't possibly be true or real or worthy of worship, even if it were.
Right.
And when I point out those things, when I mention this particular passage about Jephthah or about Elisha cursing the 42 kids so that bears would come rip them up, there's always, without fail, nobody comes back and says, yes, that was an immoral action. There are a handful of people who said that's a creation of man that shouldn't be in the Bible. There are people who are not biblical literalists.
Right.
But most of them, regardless of what their answer is, immediately shrug it off and set it to the side and come back with something that's wholly irrelevant to that topic.
Right.
That confirms what they're saying. And I've even had them say, well, Christianity's not all bad, look at this. And I'm thinking, if your advertisement for your religion is that it's not all bad, something's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different responses, I think, a lot of different ways that people deal with information that is not really positive about any belief system that they hold. On this one, though, I kind of thought a lot about how did I want to present this particular story, because I know that a lot of Christians are going to be familiar with the story, and I'm thinking that there's probably many of them that are like me that have never viewed the story quite in the way that I saw it when I started looking at it from a perspective of suicide rather than the perspective I had of it previously. So I wanted to, before we start talking about suicide, I want to talk a little bit about 911 and what happened during 911. What you had is, the official story is that you had a group of Muslims who hijacked these jets and flew them into the towers. And in an act of religious sort of fervor, they committed suicide, but not just to commit suicide, but also to kill, in their opinion, was thousands of infidels.
Right.
And so from their perspective, their deaths and the deaths of all these people were considered a success. I mean, they would look at that as a positive, successful thing, and their families were probably very proud and, thinking that this was great and my son's a martyr. And we look at that in our culture and we say, this is horrible. I mean, we considered it almost, reason to, even though I know that the attacks aren't directly related to Iraq, they've been linked by the government publicly to try to justify the war in Iraq. So this was an act that we're willing to support a war over. We consider it so wrong as a nation. And we look at that, and there's a lot of people that have attacked the religion, like the Islamic religion, and said, there's a lot of debate about, does the Quran endorse this kind of behavior, and does the Quran talk about that, and what kind of a holy book and what kind of a God could you possibly worship that would hold people in high esteem for committing suicide and killing thousands of people that have, nothing to do with them. They didn't go and kill their political opponents. They just killed a bunch of citizens working, 9 to 5, 8 to 5 in a building.
Well, the thing is, though, that they don't view it as suicide, and I'm not even necessarily sure that I would really view it as suicide. Certainly, in the strictest technical sense, they have killed themselves. But to me, it seems that there's a kind of a general connotation to suicide where you're taking your own life out of despair, depression, pain, something you no longer want to exist, and you want to put an end to your own existence.
I think that's one reason that people commit suicide.
I think, to me, there seems to be a distinction between committing suicide and perhaps sacrificing your life for a cause that you think is just. That there, in that martyrdom sense, that there may be a difference.
Well, I think that in the sense that, for me, a martyr, I agree that they are suicide martyrs.
Sure.
But I think there's also another type of martyrdom where maybe you would be brought into court for something you believe, you won't retract it, and they kill you.
Okay.
To me, that would not be suicide. That would be the court put you to death for something you believed, and you're willing to die for it, although you don't really want to die for it, and you don't think that you should die for it.
The voluntary, I'm going to kill myself.
Right. But when you go to do a suicide attack, this isn't just about somebody killing you because of what you believe. This is you saying, I'm going to kill myself and take as many people with me as I can. And that act has been just reviled in our media since it happened. And I don't think that there's anybody that I've heard write in and say, I think that was a great thing. These people should be heroes. The world isn't worthy of, people like this. And, in this country, I think it's been treated as a major negative.
Yep.
So I was wondering what a Christian would think if the Old Testament had a person in it that killed themselves and in their willful act of suicide took with them thousands of other people and then was called a hero. What would I have thought? Like, as a Christian, what would I have thought? My first thought, if somebody claimed that was in the Bible, I would probably say, you're somehow twisting something. There is no story like that.
Yeah, it's the same thing when you talk about human sacrifice.
Right.
Oh, there's no human sacrifice in the Bible, but there is. There's Jephthah.
Right.
Everybody just ignores it.
Not only is there a story like that in the Bible, it's a story that every Christian is familiar with, and I must have read it. I read it 100 times if I read it once.
Yeah.
And I never recognized that was what was going on. And it stunned me when I read it again and said, oh my God, this is what happened. I can't believe this person willfully committed suicide, killed thousands of people, and then was hailed as heroic. And not only that, God actually helped him to do it. It's recorded in the story that God helped him do it. And I'm like, okay, so if you pray to God, please let me kill myself and kill as many other people as I can, according to this story, if you're faithful enough, he's going to help you do that. And then later, his apostles are going to call you a hero. And I'm just like, okay, what is the difference between that and 9/11? Just, pick your God. But when you say the Quran, justifies this and that's a horror, your Bible justifies it, and it's just as much a horror. I mean, I don't know what else to say.
So give us the story.
Okay, we're gonna get to that story in a little bit.
All right.
I want to talk about the 4 different apologetics that I came up with about suicide. These are the 10 arguments that I found that Christians were mainly putting out to say that suicide is wrong. And let me say that there is no "thou shalt not commit suicide" in the Bible.
Right.
Number 1. They use the 10 commandments of "thou shalt not kill." That's the first common apologetic. Number 2, they use the covenant with Noah. And this was mainly, ironically, this was kind of, well, I don't know if it's ironic, it makes sense. This was mostly at the Jewish sites. The Jewish sites listed this where it quotes, "And for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each man too I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man." Now somehow in that they're saying that your life belongs to God and God accounts for it and you can't kill yourself. Like that's sort of what they interpret that verse to mean. And then the next apologetic was don't kill yourself because God has a great plan for each person. And this one I'm going to address immediately. I'm going to address the others in a moment, but this one I want to address immediately because it's not based on any Bible verse. There is no Bible verse that says God has a great plan for you. So this is just a Christian apologetic that this person and other people feel that you shouldn't kill yourself because God has a plan. My logic problem with that, it's like I found no verse to directly support this point that didn't deal with specific individuals. So there may have been examples where God had a plan for a specific person during a specific time in a story, but there's nothing that says he's got those types of plans for every person. The apologists that offered this argument are inferring that if God says he has a particular plan for one person, it means he has a plan for all people. In response to this, I would appeal to the story of Jonah, which is clearly meant to teach that you can't subvert the plans of God by an act of self-will. So one would surmise that if a suicide attempt is successful, it is part of God's plan. In other words, if God needs you to live and he's all-powerful, then you won't be able to take your own life no matter how hard you try. On the other hand, God changes his plans, such as in his many bargainings with the Hebrew patriarchs. If then a suicide is successful, this lesson would mean that perhaps God might have been against the suicide, but then his mind was changed by the pleading or arguments of the one who wants to die, so that he decided to allow it. In any case, if God has a plan for each of us, no one can predict when a suicide might be a part of that plan, rather than a deviation from it. But to say that people can subvert God's plan by sheer will brings into question God's power and authority. If his plan can be subverted against his will by people, then no one can trust anything God has said or promised for the future to be delivered, since someone could subvert it. What does it mean to say that God has a plan if all or part of it can be changed by mere human action based on nothing more than a whim?
On the last episode of the Nonprofits, and I'm sure we'll touch on each of these in a second. On the last episode of the Nonprofits, we had a debate between the four of us about free will. It was a much longer show than normal. Normally it's an hour and a half show, and we did almost 3 hours.
Right.
But about an hour and a half of it was devoted to the discussion of free will. And it was basically me and Russell in opposition to Dennis, with Jeff moderating and then Jeff coming in at the end. But there was disagreement on the issue of free will. But there's one point that we all agree on, and this to me is logically ironclad. If the Christian theology is true, if these ideas and these doctrines about an omnipotent creator God, an omniscient creator God, are true, then we don't have free will. Free will, which seems to be the underpinning of the Christian argument that God created us all and gave us free will, and that's essential somehow to whatever this test is that God's running, it's our free will to choose or not choose. But the fact of the matter is that if the Christian theology is true, we cannot possibly have free will because you have a creator God who knows the outcome.
Sure.
Now, there's some debate and discussion as to whether or not, we pretty much decided that whether the universe is deterministic or indeterministic is largely irrelevant to
Correct.
free will.
I agree.
And we were all in agreement on that, even if we were in disagreement about how we define
Right.
free will and what qualified. But one thing we could all agree on was that we don't have free will by the Christian's definition, by the idea that there is some being, some
Right.
entity who absolutely knows what the outcome of everything's going to be.
Right.
Not that God just created this world and gave us free will.
No, it's the omniscience that's the problem.
Yes, it's the omniscience. Basically, if their God exists, then he could, and he had the power to choose from different worlds or different possible outcomes. He specifically chose this one.
Correct.
He specifically chose the universe in which I start off as a Christian, I end up as an atheist, I end up hosting this TV show, and there's a caller on the phone right now, and he knows exactly when I'm going to press the button and exactly what that person's going to say. So there is no free will. It's all pre-written.
Correct.
And that's the thing. We can have discussions like we do in Nonprofits about whether or not there's free will, because there's still this kind of nebulous idea that, well, where would it be kind of pre-written or preconceived? But with the Christian notion of God, you have no free will, which
Right.
means everything that happens is God's plan, which meshes with what they're saying.
Right.
They'll say all of this is God's plan and you have free will. No, the two are incompatible.
Well, that's like this guy. I mean, he's saying God has this plan for you, so don't kill yourself. And it's like, well, how do you know that killing yourself isn't part of the plan? I mean, I'm with the person that wrote the letter asking for the topic, I don't endorse suicide. I mean, I'm not going to say that I'd be against it in every situation. I think there's situations I might consider listening to somebody's case. But at the same time, I'm not going to go tell some young person, yeah, you feel depressed, go kill yourself. I mean, I don't think that's correct. I think if you're depressed and you're young, you need to go and get some help or maybe talk to someone. That would be my advice.
What we're really talking about here is the Bible's perspective or Christian's perspective on the morality of suicide.
Correct.
But the morality of suicide is only relevant to people who have an idea or who believe in an afterlife that's contingent upon what you do here.
Right.
Because for those of us who don't believe that there's any afterlife at all, that this is the one life we get, suicide is neither moral nor immoral. If you kill yourself, it's irrelevant whether or not it's moral or not. You're dead. We can't do anything to punish you or correct that. But what we can do is work to create a society and better society, so that, because there's plenty of causes. There's chemical reasons, depressions, pain, other medical conditions.
Right.
We can work to alleviate those and build up the person's self-esteem, resolve the problems that are leading to the suicide.
Right. I want to just real quickly, before I get back into this might be just kind of like a vain thing, but just to make sure, I'm reading straight off this page, but only because I haven't memorized my notes. I want to make sure everybody understands that these are my notes. I'm not just reading something I grabbed from like an atheist site. I mean, this is my thoughts on what I saw. And I also want to point out, and I probably will point it out within the paperwork, that I pulled most of this information. In fact, I may have pulled all of it. I'll have to look. But I've pulled at least a good portion of it from either Christian or Jewish websites.
Right, the apologetic.
Right. I try as much as possible to use information from Christian apologists whenever we're talking about a topic, because I don't want to fall under the accusation that, oh, you're just looking at atheist websites, you're looking at that kind of rhetoric, and I'm not. I'm
or
looking
you're
at
arguing against caricatures and straw men.
Right. This is stuff that's posted that I came up with when I took this topic. My first thought was, okay, how do Christians, what are their thoughts on suicide? What are they saying about it? How are they defending?
We have it a little easier because we used to be in that position, and it's pretty easy for me to look, even though it hurts, to look back at exactly how I would have viewed a situation.
Yeah.
Like I can still remember what my views on abortion were and why, and now and that helps.
That's the one benefit to when I was talking about that little section of brain. That's the one benefit, is I can still apologize. I can still do the apologist thing in my head, so that when I'm reading this, when I critique it, I also know what I would have thought as a Christian about my own critique. And I think that's helpful, because not that every Christian's going to think about it the same way, but the ones that think like me, maybe I can have an impact.
You and I both tend to go to great lengths to make sure that we're, if we're going to represent an argument, that we're clear that it may not necessarily represent everybody, and what the justifications are behind it.
Okay.
If you're a Christian and you're watching the show, or if you're of any religious belief and you're watching the show, and you're sitting there saying, well, that doesn't represent what I believe, fine. The number's up. We call in and you can let us know what you believe and why. And maybe I'll agree with you, maybe I won't, but at least we can discover more.
And also know that when I use the term Christian, I know that's a broad brush. And I know that not every Christian, like for example, I've got 4 apologetics here. And you as a Christian may or may not agree with one of these. You may have your own. You may not think suicide's wrong. I don't know what you think. And I'm not claiming when I use the word Christian or I say Christians, blah, 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 blah. Yes, that represents a certain portion of Christians. It may not represent every Christian. And I understand that.
And if it doesn't represent you, that's not my fault.
That's
your fault.
But I have to use a term. You know what I mean?
You guys are all using the same term to describe thousands of little different, denominations and beliefs. There are over 1,000 denominations.
And
that identify as
within those denominations, there's individuals.
Yeah.
So I understand there's a broad spectrum. The fourth apologetic argument.
Pick a label that's more distinct.
The fourth apologetic argument that I came across was God values life. This is an argument from opinion, much like God has a plan. In order to hold this opinion, you have to disregard many biblical examples and teachings that negate the idea that God considers human life somehow inherently valuable. God directly orders the slaughter of countless children, men and women, in addition to countless slaughter of animals, including massacring every living thing, including all children on the planet, except for one family and a few of each animal. In the law, he sets the penalty as death by stoning for myriad offenses, including children who are disobedient and women who have been raped. In the New Testament, the Bible promotes the value of life after death, but there's no question of that. But it instructs its followers to not be attached to this earthly life and to not be attached to anything worldly. It presents biological living as a cursed punishment after Adam's fall from grace, and not as something people should value or hold dear. I mean, that's just how I looked at it as a Christian.
From a strict, like, mathematical analysis, if you have an infinite afterlife, then that makes this life period insignificant, irrelevant. So
well, and the afterlife is pain-free happiness. You're with your God. And there's nothing bad.
The exception to that being that the doctrine basically says that what happens during this relatively irrelevant piece of chunk of your entire life, what happens during this bit determines what happens for the rest of it.
Sure, I understand. On this, I went to the website. What was it? It was Wikipedia. That's pretty much just an open source site.
Yes.
I mean, anyone can post to that, Christians, atheists, anyone. At Wikipedia, I just wanted to look up a general overview of Jewish attitude toward suicide. I don't have a Jewish background, and I'm not as familiar with it. So I wanted to just get a little bit of general information to see what's the general attitude toward suicide among Jews. So in this one entry, it said Judaism considers suicide to be a form of self-murder, and thus a Jew who commits suicide is denied some important after-death privileges, not meaning life after death, but meaning that after you die, you're denied certain burial rights.
Yeah.
So,
because the Jewish concept of an afterlife, of some kind of spiritual existence, is really nebulous. It's not well defined.
Right. It's none to vague.
Yeah.
Let's see. And thus a Jew who commits suicide is denied some important after-death privileges, such as absolutely no eulogies should be held for that person, and burial is normally not allowed in the main section of the Jewish cemetery. However, in recent times, most suicides are deemed to be the unfortunate victims of depression or a serious mental illness, and so therefore their act, self-murder, is not deemed to be a voluntary act of self-destruction, but rather the result of an involuntary condition, and they are therefore looked upon as having died of causes beyond their control. Additionally, the Talmud recognizes that much of the mourning ritual is as much for the living survivors as for the dead, and these elements would thus still be present in the case of suicide. Furthermore, if reasonable doubt exists that the death may not have been suicide, that is, if it is unknown whether the victim fell or jumped out of a window, for example, the benefit of the doubt would be given and regular burial and mourning would take place. Lastly, suicide of a minor is considered a result of a lack of understanding, and in such a case, regular mourning would be observed. So there's sort of a sympathetic view.
That all seems to depend on the thou shalt not kill command.
It does.
That they're interpreting it as
it does. The first two, I'd say the thou shalt not kill was a mainly Jewish argument that I found online, but it was also pretty heavily picked up by Christians.
Sure.
The covenant with Noah was heavily, on the Jewish sites, not as much on the Christian sites.
Well, that's because most Christians don't accept that we're under the Noahic covenant and Jews are under the Mosaic covenant.
Well, also there was another. There's a quote that's very similar to that covenant with Noah that is in another Hebrew book. So they sort of are more into that because it's repeated somewhere.
Well, my big problem with that particular view on thou shalt not kill, that self-murder is.
We'll get to that. Okay. Yeah, that was something that I was interested in as well. But right now what we're doing is this is actually just sort of an overview, and then we're going to hit those apologetics in response.
Cool.
So the next one was also another Jewish site. It was called Torah.org. And this was a strange kind of forum posting where it was just people posting. So this was Jews posting and just talking about what would be burial rites for someone that committed suicide. And it was interesting because it was a variation of another discussion about would you get burial rights if you got a tattoo, which getting a tattoo in Jewish culture is not a good thing. They aren't, as far as I can understand, they're not allowed any kind of marks or any kind of, you can't violate the body in some way, and the tattoo is considered to be a violation. And let's see, this was in response to a question about, what kind of rights do you give to bury a suicide on the Torah.org site. And this person wrote back and said, I'm afraid that many will misunderstand this statement and its real context. I suspect that Elihu, he gives the name of, I guess, somebody who had said something about it earlier, is referring to the technically defined case of suicide. And he gives a verse that it's a Hebrew book. I apologize, I'm not versed in that, and I hate to pronounce it horribly, but it looks like Yoradiah 345 verse 2, that is clearly not the situation in the great majority of suicides. Even so, it seems to be the consensus of the, I wish I knew these Jewish words, the post-scheme, that even such a person, a suicide spoken about in Halakha, is not excluded from A, burial, nor B, burial in a Jewish cemetery. It is important to note, and he goes on, but this particular Jew is saying that's not true. You can bury, suicide or someone with a tattoo in the main portion of a Jewish cemetery. So I don't know if that's kind of up to the region that you live in, or up to your particular, temple section, or up to the cemetery itself. I don't know who determines that. But there was some debate among the Jews themselves that I looked at about whether or not you would have full burial rights and bury somebody in the regular section of a cemetery.
So there's some disagreement about it.
Right, and this was the one that caught my eye, I think, most of all. This person responded in that same forum and said, in general, there's a rule of, and he gives a whole line of Hebrew here that I won't even dare to try to read, but he interprets it, thankfully, that one does not bury a righteous person next to a wicked person. Then he goes on with his own statement. This would mean that impious Jews would be relegated to a separate section of a Jewish cemetery. Many later authorities wanted to exclude people who were cremated on this basis. And then he quotes an author, R.D.Z. Hoffman, notes that if we use this rule to restrict anyone who is a sinner, we would never bury anyone who is not fully observant in a Jewish cemetery. So his opinion is, if you can't bury a suicide in the regular portion of the cemetery, you can't bury anyone, because no one's dying perfect as far as the law is concerned. And so, who are you gonna pick and choose whose sin was greater and who can be in this section and who can't? So there, he's equating the sin of what they would consider, I guess, the crime, because he's considering, and to them it would be something that they would consider against the law. So to them it would actually be a crime. He's considering the crime of suicide to be completely equal to any other crime in the law, that any infraction of the law is an infraction of the law, and suicide is no better or worse than any other infraction. Yeah.
Let me jump in real quick. We had a caller. By the way, the phone number's up. We'll be taking calls very soon, but we did have a caller on line one who had a question and hung up before we got around to it.
Oh, okay.
And that's fine. I'll answer it as briefly as I can. And the question was, why do atheists seem to know so much about the Bible?
Oh,
And I have a couple of answers. I don't know. Would be the first, because not all atheists do. Tracie and I do, because we were also ex-Christians. But I think one of the reasons you'll find that so many atheists know so much about the Bible is that the more you know about the Bible, the less likely you are to actually be a Christian.
Right.
It's pretty much that simple. When you actually read it and understand it, when you read it and consider it without looking to make it biased towards what you want to believe. Bertrand Russell or somebody said that there was no greater impetus for atheists than reading the Bible.
Right. Yeah, I remember that quote. But I'm not going to get off the topic here. But I brought in three little testimonies, I guess, that have to do with people who converted from Christianity to atheism. And I think that when you hear these stories, it sort of explains a little bit about why atheists know a lot about the Bible and why they're interested in the Bible. And it's because, and like you say, there's different types of atheists, people that are atheists for different reasons, I guess I should say. Just like there's people that are Christians for different reasons.
Right.
And some people are atheists and they don't know, don't care. It always seemed like bunk to them. They never bought into it. Their families never brought them to church, and they don't want to hear it. And then you have the people who were very devoted Christians who studied themselves into atheism. And that was kind of what I had here. But I want to save that kind of for the next time I'm on. I wanted to do something on faith and on, what kind of deconverts people, or what deconverts the thinking person or the person who was a Christian. Why would they become an atheist from Christianity?
We almost did that show today.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
we-
would have done it today, except for
we-
we got the suicide email.
Well, we almost did it when you weren't here. When we
Yeah.
were getting ready to go on the air, we were just going to have people talk about
Yeah.
what convinced them.
It's like I really am, want to get into those notes, but I know my stuff is long, and so I don't want to go there right now. Anyway, this was what some information I found on suicide from Christian perspectives from an apologist site. This is a site called faithmania.com. And
Well, there's a good one.
yeah, and the title of the site is Faith Mania, Sharing the Joy of Faith. So that's a Christian site. And he had an article about suicide and Christianity historically, which I thought was kind of interesting. He says, Shakespeare said, against self-slaughter there is a prohibition so divine that cravens my weak hand. This is part of the article that I'm reading. That was just a quote from Shakespeare, but this is not my view. This is the author of the Christian site. Sure. He was expressing the attitude of the vast majority towards suicide. We did not find that prohibition in either the Old Testament or the New Testament. The whole Bible does oppose the taking of one's life, even if there is no explicit prohibition. Let me just say that if there's no hope prohibition and you read it and you get the opinion that something's wrong, that's your opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how else to say that. If there's no prohibition, it's your opinion.
You might as well say there's no whole prohibition in the Bible against tap dancing.
Well, there's no prohibition
but the whole Bible
against.
speaks to
Yeah,
it.
yeah. I mean, you'd like it to say that it's wrong, but it doesn't. And so you're just going to say I think the whole Bible says it's wrong. It's like, well, then why isn't it in there? But we'll get to that in a minute too.
There's no prohibition against whole wheat pasta, but
anyway, the
Bible
article
pretty much
goes on to
says
say life is sacred. God is its author. We are to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. We are to do all that we do to the glory of God. No one can doubt that self-destruction is sinful and opposed to the whole plan of God. And I put a notice that there's no citation offered.
Oh,
So, I mean, he has no Bible verse to back up what he just said. It's just simply his opinion. What does history, this is him talking still.
You know the abbreviation IBID that means
Yeah,
the same source?
sure.
We should come up with something similar that just means I pulled this out of my ass.
Yeah, I mean, I just put a note, no citation offered. The article goes on to say, what does history tell us? The question was debated in the early church. One of the big questions was this: could a Christian woman take her own life in times of persecution to escape the dishonor she would suffer by brute soldiers who would rape her before she was killed? Eusebius, the church historian, Chrysostom, the golden-mouthed preacher, and Jerome, the Bible translator, all favored it as the lesser of two evils. So in other words, this is Christian apologists from a long time ago saying, if you're a woman and you're going to be raped, murder yourself, and it sucks, but it's better than being raped. So just go ahead and put the knife through your heart right now.
I wish more people would study Eusebius and Jerome and the ideas of these early church fathers. Because Eusebius is the one who basically said that it's okay to lie for God. You can forge documents, you can make up whatever you want, as long as the end goal brings people to God.
Well, a lot of early Christians took his advice, apparently.
Oh, yeah.
Augustine condemned it, however, and later church councils did also, which is probably why this guy condemns it today. They passed a law refusing church burial to anyone who did so. The debate arose out of life's battles where women did take their lives to escape the awful fate awaiting them. Even Augustine allowed exceptions, since some were called martyrs and made saints. So if you killed yourself as a martyr, that was the exception.
Now, one might wonder why these women were expecting to be raped, and I think it's because if you read the Old Testament, whenever God sent David or somebody out to kill all the neighbors, they'd send them out to kill them all, but bring back the young virgins.
Right.
So I think they didn't have to look no further than their own book to have a fear of being raped.
The Modern Catholic Encyclopedia says this question is still open for debate.
Ah.
What is not debatable is the fact that true Christians, and I love that term, did take their own lives. And to be honest, I'm glad he said that. True Christians did take their own lives.
Still, somebody else can go back and say they weren't true Christians.
And I'm sure people will. Yeah. But I mean, it was nice to see an apologist recognize that just because someone did something he didn't agree with, it didn't make them not a true Christian in his mind. And I thought that was pretty unique of this particular writer. In more modern times, we find that after the Reformation, the question arises again. There was no problem with suicide in the so-called Dark Ages. It became a universal problem only since the Enlightenment. In Tiraspol, Russia, in 1897, 28 persons buried themselves alive to escape a census which they felt was evil and against God's will. In 1666, Russian zealots looked for the Antichrist to come so soon that they urged Christians to escape him by suicide and entering into heaven.
You know, that's if you're trying to avoid a head count and decide that killing yourself's the option, you've kind of helped the head count.
Yeah.
You no longer count. How is that? Wow.
Whole
Your
community.
census is evil, so I'm not going to participate.
Whole communities hailed with enthusiasm the gospel of death, and they put it into practice. The purpose of sharing this history is to show that God's children can and have been victims of false and fanatical leadership. So there goes the true Christian. In other words,
You mean like Jerome and
right, he sits there and says that there are these early respected Christian apologists who thought that this was okay. And then he says false and fanatical leadership is what drove these people to do these things. And I'm like, okay, you don't agree with this interpretation, so you're calling it false. But you've said at the beginning what your interpretation is, and you haven't offered scripture to back it up. So you have a difference of opinion with this person, and you're just labeling them false. And he says, have even taken their own lives as a result. Martyrdom was so prized at one time that Christians fought to be killed. Some early Christians deliberately threw themselves to their death under the delusion that a violent death gained merit. And this is my response to that article. So the opinion of former generations of Christians becomes false to this modern Christian. How does he know, since so many interpreted it differently in the past, that his interpretation is not simply colored by the present social stigmas and feelings surrounding the act of suicide? Perhaps the opinion that the Bible condemns suicide is false. How would we know, since Christians themselves can't agree? And the Bible lacks a direct law against the act. We're all working on inference, and that means we're interpreting it with our own opinions. I certainly couldn't say that a Christian who would die for his belief isn't a real Christian who had his heart and mind set to do whatever God asked of him. So why should I believe that so many past, sincere, and devoted Christians were simply misguided, simply on the word of other Christians who have differing interpretations of the same information? Meanwhile, why is it unsafe to assume that if God wanted to outlaw suicide, he would have done so directly? He directly outlawed eating shellfish. Was it more important to get to God that the Jews understood they shouldn't eat crabs than that they didn't kill themselves? I mean, seriously.
Yeah. Let's, since we started late and we're going to end up running short, we're going to go ahead and start taking some calls.
It's a good breaking point because that's kind of the overview of the Jewish and Christian view, and then we'll start in with the apologetics after the call.
And, you know, like we pointed out earlier, from our point of view, obviously, it's irrelevant what the Bible says about suicide. I'm personally of the opinion that you know, we should be working to improve society to correct the things that are likely to cause suicide.
But somebody asked, and so we're answering. We're accommodating.
We'll go ahead and take a call. John, how you doing?
How you doing? Man, you guys are so informative today.
Well, thank you.
She is.
A couple of things. One, aren't Buddhists atheists?
Some of them.
Yes.
And wouldn't it be, as far as the Christian right coming down on you, wouldn't it be not easier, but if you were atheists instead of atheists?
But that's what we are.
Yes, I know. Oh, that is what I
No, he means we are atheists.
I mean, atheist.
Yes.
What you're saying there, that distinction, that's it. That's atheism. It's the simplest definition, a lack of a belief in a God.
That one letter makes all the difference.
Yes, it does make a difference. Well, anyway, when you
I think what you're talking about is kind of the extra baggage that tends to come with the atheist label.
Exactly.
And that's my purpose for doing this show, and one of the reasons why I could call myself all kinds of things.
Yeah.
I could say I'm a secular humanist, I'm a rationalist, I'm a naturalist, a materialist, a free thinker, whatever. I choose atheist because it directly addresses what I consider to be the problem.
Yes.
And the problem is theistic belief, irrational beliefs, faith-based beliefs, as opposed to evidence-based beliefs. And correcting, and so while there is negative baggage on the atheist label, I wear it and hope to try and convert people's opinions of what that label actually means and who it applies to.
And I think it's really good that you provide a discussion with this, because I think sometimes it does strengthen other people's belief in a God.
Yeah, and I've had discussions with a lot of people that said, thanks so much for your show. I'm a Christian, and after listening to you, I'm an even stronger Christian. And I say, hey, you know, good for you. At least you thought about it. I can't help it. You came to the wrong conclusion.
No. Anyway, when you start going after all Christians, there's a difference, you know, as Sivius, there's a difference between the Jacobites and the Nestorians. And when you start going after the Christians, traditionally the Jacobites were the Trinity. You know, they started bringing in this magical Trinity thing, where the Nestorians were Jesus was basically a human helping other people out. And then they started scattering into the countryside, and they had to round them all up as far as Constantine the Great in 319. So when you start going after Christians, you're really going after the Jacobite doctrines.
Well, yeah, but we're going after the majority of modern Christians. Doctrine,
Yes,
and
I
the
agree.
people who won the doctrine wars pretty
now,
much dictate the way things are
Jehovah's
now.
Witnesses don't believe in a Trinity.
True.
And
There we go.
I would say that they read the Bible and they're into the Bible and they don't believe
But they're a
Trinity.
fairly small portion of the Christian population.
I know
Yeah.
more of them than I thought I'd ever know.
Okay, now let's go back to God. As far as God goes, God is an equation. And an equation goes, if I believe in something, again, it's again, and I've talked about this before, it's a symbiotic synergism. If I have the baggage of my own and I believe I'm not worthy of being cured, then it's more difficult for me to be cured. But if I believe that there is a God there, then that transcends my own inability to see my own cure. So that if I
Right.
do believe in a God, that transcends all that, so that the belief in a God is a synergistic symbiotic
People use it.
equation.
I'm not
Yeah.
denying that there may possibly be benefits to believing something
And I don't
that's
think
false.
he is either. I mean, I think he's just explaining it.
There's lots of false things that I could believe that may act as a crutch or a mechanism
Yes.
to actually have a positive effect.
Yes.
I don't deny that.
Right. What I think what you're saying though is that if a person feels like if you have low self-esteem,
Right.
you're not going to tend to want to try to help yourself because you don't feel like you can.
Right.
And so if you have this belief in a God,
Yes.
it sort of gives you this bigger thing in your mind that you then go and help yourself actually because you think
Yes.
God is helping you do it.
So that this
Right.
belief in a God doesn't that symbiotic synergism, doesn't that equate to God?
I would say yes, that God is a symbol for many things. And in that particular example, God is a symbol for the self. Because
Yes.
you've got the person helping themselves but calling it God.
Yes.
So yes, I agree.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right.
I think
ahead.
the distinction is if the person actually believes that there's a God as
Right.
opposed to just believing that they're believing in a God,
Right.
then it's not.
Right.
And most people actually believe in the God.
Oh.
They live their lives and act based on a belief in the belief that the belief is valid.
I think it's still a symbol. I just think that just because someone takes a symbol as literal, they may not recognize they're using this as a symbol,
Right.
but they are.
Yeah.
It's just like the flag. Some people freak out over flag burning, and you'd think that they almost think that you're somehow really destroying the country.
Well, sure.
And it's a symbol. They know that's not the country, and they know that's not the Constitution, and they know that's not our nation. But it freaks them out to see it burn because the
Right.
symbol is so real to them.
Right.
And
But
what he's
I don't
descri-
think that people look at the flag in the same way that they look at their God.
No, but I'm just using it as an example to say that I believe the thing is a symbol for self, even though the person that's affected by it is internalizing it to the point that they think it's like a real thing. It's still they're still using it as a symbol for self, but they don't understand that they don't understand it's a
And
symbol.
I'm saying that their lack of understanding is relevant.
Right.
It makes a difference in the way they view it, but it's still a symbol.
Can I go ahead?
Sure.
Go ahead. One last point. When you start going after the Bible, you know, and as far as what the Bible is, since I study the Bible, if you read the Bible more as a historical document, and if you look at God said this and God said that, and you replace God with king, then you come up with another kind of book. And if you replace that,
Sure.
which is called heaven, and put palace or ziggurat, then you end up with a different book completely. So that when you talk about the Revelation and end times, that was the time when the peoples of the East was going to take Rome or Judea back from the Romans, and they never did get to take Judea back from the Romans. As far as end times goes, the children of light and the children of darkness, because Rome were slavers and blood sacrificers, Egyptians were slavers, blood sacrificers, Greeks were slavers, blood sacrificers, and so were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But the people from the East that followed Ashoka's Ten Commandments of 325 BC, he interjected thou shalt not kill in the Ten Commandments to mean the ahimsa way, which is thou shalt not kill anything. And he had the first endangered species program, he had the first forest protection program, and he was the one that trying to free people from slavery at 325 BC. So those people that came from Babylon and India and Pakistan and Iran, those people were holding a different kind of Ten Commandments, and they were going to override the Judean Roman people, or Judea anyway, and take it back from the Sadducees, who were pretty much money changers. That's why Jesus came in and said, "Hey, you guys are just a bunch of money changers."
Yeah, I'm with you, and I think
Okay.
I think there's a lot along those lines. One problem is that I have a difficult time actually looking at the Bible as a historical book, because while there are elements that are consistent with history, they're not. The book can't be a testimony to itself,
Right.
and we would seek independent confirmation from other books. So while the Bible is definitely interesting, and I spend time studying the formation of the Bible and early Christianity and the social political structure around that era,
Right.
I have this, and I'll admit it's kind of this knee-jerk reaction anytime anybody mentions let's look at the Bible as a historical document, because
Right.
it's really not. It's kind of an anthology of
Okay.
Jewish history and stuff that in some cases, and I'm talking about the Old Testament in that case, but in some cases it meshes with what we find about history from other sources, and in some cases it doesn't. So really, the Bible can be just another element of history in conjunction with everything else.
Yeah, and you can look at who put all the stories together to make what we call the Bible today.
Yeah, sure.
And then you look at that and go, wait a minute, how many of these stories were left out? So I think there are some degrees of truth in it, but I agree with you. Some of it is kind of, science fantasy, and there's some true history behind it too.
Yeah, I don't find it drastically different from any other similar book, the Quran or anything else, or any of the writings. That's the other thing, and I think Ingersoll may have made this point along with Voltaire and others, that there's nothing in the Bible that is shocking or insightful for the time in which it was written. There are no ideas or broad philosophies that transcend the mindset of the barbarians who happen to be writing it at time X, or the early Greek and Romans in the New Testament. There's no, and you can see it change. The God in the theology of the Old Testament versus the God in the theology of the New Testament, it changes, and it reflects the changes in society over that several thousand-year period.
Right,
Right.
at 900 BC, there was still sacrifices going on, and women weren't treated properly. And now even today, and then when Jesus came around in his day, or however you might want to call him, then he did interject that Ashoka, respect all life forms. And I think as people, we're still evolving into a kinder, gentler society, hopefully. So in the raising consciousness, I think it's basically humans evolving and raising one's own consciousness through writing, basically.
I think that's it, and it's
Good
it's a
analysis.
mechanism like you and Trace were talking about. Thanks a lot for calling, John.
Thank
Appreciate
you
it.
very much.
Have
Bye.
a good day. We got Steve. How you doing?
Oh, good. I just want to say something about the morality of suicide. That I would say, what you said earlier about it. There is no when there's no absolute morality, where it's just an absolute yay or nay, and under all circumstances, then it becomes something that you have to judge on a case by case basis, or situationally. And but I would say personally, I would, even though I realize there are cases like extreme pain, you're on fire and you have a gun, or something like that. I mean, you can come up with things.
That's a good one.
But basically, I think it is immoral. I mean, my general inclination is you're wasting your life, and that's all you got. And we really need to, encourage people not to do it. It's not immoral in any
definitely agree there.
magic way.
Yeah, I don't see the need to even call it immoral.
Right.
Or to me, the immoral things are relevant. I agree with you 100% on what it is and whether or not we should be addressing it and trying to prevent it in people. But to me, it's kind of pointless to say it's immoral.
I also just want to say that, I mean, in my by my definition, morality is just whatever you personally believe about it. So, I mean,
Right.
if for you it's just like, even in cases where I know there's like a merciful sort of angle to this particular suicide, it still bothers me. So
Right.
for you, it would be an immoral act. I mean, that would be your personal
Yeah.
decision to say this is just not moral.
It would be a violation of
Yeah.
my own morals and ethics to actually commit suicide, because I recognize that what I do has effect on other people, and that while I might be dead, there are people who are going to be sad about that, and I will have caused them pain. There are other people who would probably be very happy, but I don't want to make those people happy, so I'm not going to be doing
So you're
that.
living for spite.
You bet. I have no problem at all living to spite those who don't like me.
Well, when when the topic comes up of where do atheists get their morality, and this is why I use the word moral, I would just say I normally just think it's extremely unfortunate.
Yeah.
I really think it's a tragic thing. But the word morality, I used it because that topic comes up, is where do you get your morality? Can't you just do anything that you want?
Right.
And the fact is, we do have morality in the sense of there are things that we consider to be things to avoid doing, that we at all costs or at extreme costs, attempting to make things better in certain ways to prevent things, and also feel awful when we hear about things happening.
Right.
And that's morality.
We get our morality in exactly the same way that everybody else, including Christians, do. It's just we don't make the mistake of attributing it to a book.
Right. And it's the one other little thing about suicide, which is I've always thought that suicide is the one little piece of inalienable rights that people really cannot lose. It's almost, you can be incapacitated so that you cannot kill yourself. But in terms of the act of either deciding to continue to live or not to continue to live, that is left as your own, and pretty much there is no means of taking it away from you, and it's the one inalienable right. In terms of just because there's no way to.
You can't prosecute a suicide.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Although, in fairness, I would say that freedom of thought and freedom of suicide might both qualify.
Freedom of thought's a good one, yeah.
There are
That's right.
mind
You
controls
can't
and brainwashing,
prevent-
but likewise, I could strap somebody to a bed to prevent them prevent them.
But he's saying after
suicide.
you've
Yeah.
committed the crime, there's no
Yes.
prosecution for it.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely.
And I agree with you. Freedom of thought is the same kind of thing. But those things that are yours, I like it that those are mine and not something that was somehow magically. It's really all of God. I mean, I consider those mine. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm greedy.
I think when we're talking about rights and what you have a right to, in addition to having your own thoughts, one of the things about a right to life, in my opinion, is that it should include the right to end it if you so choose. It's unfortunate. I realize it's going to cause some people, pain. Maybe, I guess you could arrange a suicide to where it's nice and neat and nobody has to clean up all your mess. And I'm not talking about the actual suicide, but the mess of your life that's left after you're gone. But the right that you have to your own life and to how to live your own life, that's, I'm not advocating suicide. I think it's a horrible tragedy that anybody would do it. But it is an example of exercising the one control over your life, as you pointed out, that nobody else can really take from you.
Right. Anyway, thanks for having your show.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Appreciate it. So we wanted to actually talk about the counter-apologetics. I wanted to make a quick note that, because since we were kind of a little disheveled today when we went on the air, we are going to be going to Threadgill's after the show. The show's off at 6 o'clock. We'll be down there around 6:30, maybe as late as 6:45. Any atheist or atheist-friendly people are welcome to come down. You don't have to be a member. You can even be a believer. I don't mind, as long as you're coming down to have a good meal and a good conversation, not to come down to preach or provoke. If you're gonna, we have phone lines open. You're free to call in and state your opinion and state your mind. We don't need to ruin my meal over it.
I'm going to try to rip through some of this because I
Sure.
made big promises at the beginning. I have to get to that. Okay, the first
I'm pretty sure I'll
apologetic
slow you down.
first apologetic we listed was the thou shalt not kill, people using that as a means to condemn suicide or say that the Bible condemns suicide within the commandment of thou shalt not kill.
Yeah. I disagree.
At myjewishlearning.com, they quote the Jewish religion, A Companion. And it says, those who take their own lives are technically not entitled to Jewish burial and mourning rites, but suicide as a freely chosen act with the above consequences has been nearly defined out of existence by mental health considerations in the development of Jewish law. And in most cases, death by suicide are treated like all other deaths. Then the website posted, in Jewish teaching, the prohibition of suicide is not contained in the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. Obviously, it does not follow from the fact that a man may not take the life of another that he may not take his own life. It follows from this that suicide and murder are two separate offenses in the Jewish tradition, as they are in most cultures. Suicide is not homicide and is not covered in the Decalogue.
Not only that, but we've talked many times about how that sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, is really poorly worded because it doesn't really tell us anything.
Yeah.
There are some people who would love to interpret it as thou shalt not kill
Anything.
anything. And there are others who interpret it as thou shalt not murder, and therefore
That's incorrect.
they're justified
Yeah.
in killing in the war or whatever else. My thing is that because it's so poorly worded, well, I think that's evidence that no infinitely wise being wrote it, but we'll leave that aside. The poor wording of it is such that you can't really draw much out of it.
Yeah.
You kind of have to draw your own conclusion out of it and take it as this nebulous, try not to
Right.
wrongly murder people and use that as an assumption. And I don't think that, I think that there's an exception in case for everything. If the caller before who talked about if you're on fire and happen to have a gun, if you're on fire and I happen to have a gun and you're begging me to shoot you,
Right.
I think, and there's no other way out, and we've narrowed down this really ridiculous scenario. I think it would be the kind thing to do that.
Yeah. It's certainly a debatable issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think it's as cut and dried and black and white as a lot of people would want to say from just one.
Well, that's what's
forward
interesting is
command.
in my mind when we're talking about, if someone's going to use the apologetic, you shall not kill or thou shalt not kill as the defense against suicide, then the question becomes, what does it mean? What does this verse mean? And boy, that was tough to find, let me tell you.
Does consent matter?
I looked up trying to find if there was Hebrew word for suicide, Hebrew word for murder, what is this? And finally found what I was looking for at jewishvirtuallibrary.org. It says, suicide in Jewish law is a very serious offense. The Talmud says, for him who takes his own life with full knowledge of his action, the Hebrew word is badat, no rites are to be observed. Now see, that's a straightforward condemnation right there. I mean, that's cut and dry. Don't take your own life. There is to be no rending of clothes and no eulogy, but people should line up for him at the end of the burial ceremony, and the mourner's blessing should be recited as the family passes through out of respect for the living. The general rule is whatever rites are normally performed for the benefit of the survivors should be observed. Whatever is normally done out of respect for the dead should not be observed. So that's not out of the Bible, though. I mean, let me make it clear that this is another Jewish book that they consider to be scripture that a Christian would not. A Christian would say that's apocryphal. So that verse doesn't count if you're
Right.
a Christian. That you can't use that verse as a Christian
It lost
to say.
the doctrine wars, so
Right.
we must disregard it.
Right. Jewish law does not, however, place all suicides in the same category. And this is still reading from the website. This is not me. One category of suicide, as stated above, includes those who are in full possession of their physical and mental faculties, badat, when they take their lives. A second category includes those who act on impulse or who are under severe mental strain or physical pain when committing suicide. Jewish law speaks of an individual in this second category as being an anus, meaning a person under compulsion, and hence not responsible for his actions. All burial and mourning rites are observed for him. The first anus in Jewish history was King Saul, who after being defeated by the Philistines on Mount Gilboa realized what would have happened to him if he were taken alive. He therefore impaled himself on his sword. This action gave rise to the expression anus kashal, meaning as distressed as Saul. Consequently, Joseph Caro, in his Code of Jewish Law, and most authorities of subsequent generations have ruled that the majority of suicides are to be considered as distressed as Saul and as having acted under compulsion when taking their own lives. As such, they are not responsible for their actions and are to be accorded the same courtesies and privileges granted the average Jew who has met a natural death. So they are pretty lenient with somebody who is under mental distress or physical duress, which is probably most cases of suicide today in our country. You don't get many people falling on their swords to avoid dishonor. You might get that in Asia like a while back, and that was definitely a theme in history, but you don't see that quite so much anymore. Then this is from another, this was another site. This was titled, the title of this homepage was The Voice, Biblical and Theological Resources for Growing Christians. And in this is a Christian apologist writing about that particular verse, thou shalt not kill, as it would pertain to, he's not really writing about how it would pertain to suicide, but without knowing he did. For what I'm looking for, he did include that, but this wasn't his particular topic. The argument is often made in various, I'm reading from his site, so this is again not my notes, this is the site notes. The argument is often made in various applications of you shall not kill, that this commandment is really a specific prohibition of murder. This evokes a range of connotations for the English word murder with a primary emphasis on unlawful killing, premeditated and deliberate killing of another human being. This would be opposed to other forms of killing, such as legal execution, war, or self-defense. Appeal is usually made to the original Hebrew by arguing that the word used does not mean killing in general, but refers specifically to murder. This view is supported in some modern translations, such as the New Revised Standard Version, where it says in Exodus, you shall not murder, that's Exodus 20:13, and Deuteronomy 5:17, you shall not murder. However, a close examination of the Hebrew word used here raises questions about this translation. The Hebrew word used in both versions of the Ten Commandments, ratsach, it's called ratsach or ratsach. It's R-A-T-S-A-C-H, and it is completely different than the two words for suicide, is not nearly as specific as the English word murder. For example, in the priestly code of Numbers, the word is used twice for legal killing done by the blood avenger. Also, there are several places in Deuteronomy as well. Let's see, he's actually giving verses, so I'm trying to read through his verse quotes. Scattered through Numbers and Joshua that use the word to refer to unintentional killing or causing accidental death, which we would call manslaughter. In other words, the same word that is used in thou shalt not kill is also used to refer later on to killing someone accidentally.
Thou shalt not commit manslaughter.
Right. It can
I
also
didn't mean to.
It can also mean to murder or assassinate. A cognate noun means shattering or mortal wound, which suggests that the word emphasizes violence, not whether or not the action was legal or premeditated. So in his opinion, this all has to do with what you're doing to somebody else. So the Jewish words for suicide, there's two of them, one under duress and one knowing full well what you're doing. Neither of them matches the word in you shall not kill. And the word in thou shalt not kill means all these sorts of things, which all seem to relate to how you treat someone else, not what you do to yourself. Yeah. So I couldn't really find anything to support that thou shalt not kill would include some sort of a restriction on suicide as well. It doesn't seem to include that from what I could find at apologist sites. Number 2 was the covenant with Noah. And that quote was, and for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from every man, and from each man too. I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. And this was at JudaismAbout.com in their library. And this is from a rabbi. And I'm going to go ahead and read this. There's a little bit of a note to it at the bottom. He says, Judaism regards suicide as a criminal act. Someone who commits suicide is considered a murderer. It matters not whether he kills someone else or himself. His soul is not his, or his life is not his to extinguish. Judaism's opposition to suicide is found in the story of Noah's Ark. After the flood, God says to Noah, your blood which belongs to your souls I will demand. From the hand of every beast will I demand it. From the hand of every man, from the hand of every man who is his brother will I demand the life of man. this is God, I guess, that reveres human life.
Yeah.
When a Jew commits suicide, and this is still the site, when a
He
Jew
reveres it so much he kills everybody but 8 people and
And
then warns
everything.
them how much. Yeah.
When a Jew commits suicide, he is not permitted a full Jewish burial, and there is even a debate whether the 7-day mourning period is observed, whether the Kaddish prayer is said. In practice, however, today, suicide is usually treated as a normal death, since it is assumed that the person was not in a normal state of mind. But we still see the gravity by which Judaism views suicide. And here's a note from me. I need to mention that this article references souls and areas of afterlife, like different parts of heaven. So this is not really adhering to a strict ancient Hebrew doctrine, because they have a vague to no mention of an afterlife, and of the soul is, really an amorphous sort of, a lot of them don't believe in it. After you die, you sleep with your fathers. So
Yeah.
this is somebody that's strongly believing in an afterlife, and that's just one segment of Judaism, which I don't think is really representative of the ancient Judaism that you're seeing in the Old Testament, at least not from what I've read.
Now, somebody probably accused me of reading this passage too literally, although I'm a big believer in, if I don't have enough information about the author's intent, or who the hell the author was in the first place, and the context isn't enough to clear it up, then the simplest reading is preferred. There's no reason to
Embellish.
Make this a mess of interpretation. So at the end, when it says that he'll demand an accounting of the lifeblood from his fellow man, that means that if I kill myself, my lifeblood will be accountable by my fellow man, not by me.
Right.
So, and since there can be no fellow man who's directly responsible for my suicide.
Well, here's the thing. What happened is I went ahead and looked this verse up, and what I found was that the best response to this particular apologist argument is to just read the verse in context, because it doesn't mean anything about suicide.
Yeah, maybe there's no reason. Maybe the reason that God isn't specific about suicide in the Bible is because after He created everything and set it all in motion, He killed Himself.
Okay.
All right.
All right. It took me a second. All right. Anyway, let's look at the actual context. This is in Genesis 9. It's verses 1 through 6, and this is coming from the New International Version.
Hey, I've got that.
Yeah, that's the one you've got. God's covenant with Noah is the subhead in the actual Bible. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall upon all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air, upon every creature that moves along the ground, and upon all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves will be food for you, just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything." And just point of interest, this is the first time God mentions that you're allowed to eat animals.
Yeah.
Verse 4, "But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it, and for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each man too I will demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made man." So in other words, if you kill somebody, people are going to kill you.
Unless you're Cain.
Right, and so here's the point.
God's gonna
this
put a mark
verse
on
is
you to
not
protect
addressing that. It's not saying you can't kill yourself. It's saying that if you kill somebody, you're going to pay for it.
Yeah.
And it's definitely when you read the next verse, verse 6, you see very clearly that they're talking about murder.
It's also it's a good example of the sort of primitive theology that you see in the very early parts of the Old Testament, where this idea of lifeblood, that that the essence of who and what you are, it's kind of like, modern Christians talk about, well, follow your heart, or your heart will lead you. My heart doesn't do anything but pump blood. It's my brain that does the thinking. But in a metaphoric sense, it's follow the heart, and they're actually talking about something completely different.
Correct.
During the early, formations of religions like this, there were these, we didn't know anything about science. The seat of the soul was in the blood, or in some cases in the liver, or whatever they did happen to know about.
Okay. All right. Okay, so then now I want to talk about some direct examples of suicide in the Bible, because that was really the two apologetics that I wanted to address.
Because we got like 5 minutes and we want to get that one big story in.
Oh, no, is that it? Okay.
Yeah, that's it, 5 minutes.
Okay, here's the suicide killer.
Dun, dun, dun.
This is from Judges 16:25-30. And it has to do with Samson. Samson had long hair. He had a vow when he was born. His parents devoted him to God. He never cut his hair. It was part of the vow. At some point, he's betrayed by his wife. He's captured. They cut his hair. They have a lot against him because he's killed a lot of Philistines. They take his eyes out and they make him a prisoner and they mock him. And according to Judges 16:25-30, when they stood him among the pillars, they took him out, they were all drinking and happy, they took him out, they stood him between the pillars to make a mockery of him. Samson said to the servant who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple so that I may lean against them." Now the temple was crowded with men and women, all the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "O sovereign Lord, remember me. O God, please strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached toward the 2 center pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." He then pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than when he lived. And my first thought as a Christian would be, that's Old Testament. But here's the thing. Hebrews 11:32-38 is New Testament. And in that verse, it's in the middle of a listing of all the Old Testament patriarchs and all the faithful men and women that lived in the Old Testament and all the heroes from the Jewish literature. And it mentions Samson. It says, "What more can I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, the guy who killed his own daughter as a sacrifice to God is listed here. David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life. Others were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers, flogging, while others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated." Verse 38 says the world was not worthy of them. Samson killed thousands of people in his suicide murder pact with God, and he was beyond, the worth of the world.
It's really funny because at the beginning, you actually had sent me your notes and email, so I'd have a heads up about what you were going to talk about. I didn't read everything. I just skimmed it and looked for things, and I didn't bother to look up that passage. So when we started talking today, and you mentioned how you read this passage and it hit you that you'd never even thought of it that way. I didn't know which passage you were going for. And when you read it, I was like, I've never thought of it that way. Till this very moment, it didn't hit me. And that's because when you're a believer, and it's like the passage with Jephthah and other things, you read things, you have a bias.
Absolutely.
And the funny thing is that Christianity tends, at least modern Christianity, tends to reinforce this bias by acknowledging that it exists and encouraging it. Because what really happens is, while I would gloss over that passage and see the good and not see that it was actually a suicide pact, which may still have been good. There may be situations where that kind of thing is good. But not seeing that, I saw something else, and it's because the read it with the eye of the Holy Spirit kind of mentality. We're out of time, and we appreciate everybody who watched. We'll try and fix the technical difficulties before next week. Thanks a lot for tuning in. We'll be back again next week, assuming nothing breaks down, and have a good, safe week.
I'm so glad we got to squeeze that in at the end. It was great. We started with it, we ended with it. That's perfect. Yeah, wasn't that shocking? I was just freaking out when I was reading that. I was like, oh my God. And on the way here, I was like...